He stopped long enough at Guimaras Strait between Panay and Negros to take on fuel from his 7 tankers. En route, his force was intercepted by Admiral Ugaki's battleships, and the cruisers and destroyers hastening northward from the New Guinea area began to join up. The guessing game was over. The American fleet would be found somewhere around Saipan, and the decisive battle would be fought there. The Americans had played into the hands of the devisers of Plan Ago. From the beginning of the planning stage of the Marianas operation, the Americans knew they were moving into a wholly different sort of combat than they had known on the coral atolls of the Gilberts and the Marshalls. The latter were bits of sand created by living coral reef. The former were mountain tops rising up above some of the deepest sea gulches in the world. Back from the shore, the land was fertile, wooded and rugged, serrated by hills and valleys. The people of the Marshalls and Gilberts were Melanesians, dark, primitive, and friendly to the Americans. When the Marines had taken Beshio Island in Tarawa, they encountered a few islanders who led them to the Japanese on other islands. When the Marines and soldiers landed in the Marshalls, they were also assisted by the islanders. They could expect no such help on Saipan or Tinian, the 2 major objectives. Guam was an exception. The island had been an American territory since 1899, and the Chamorros there were mostly loyal to the United States after the fall of Guam to Japan in 1942. But the other islands of the Marianas had been first Spanish and then German possessions. The Japanese captured the islands in 1914, and the League of Nations gave Japan a mandate to rule them in 1920. The Japanese had come to the Marianas in force, and by 1941 Japanese outnumbered Chamorros 2-1 in the 14 Marianas aside from Guam. The islands had been made an essential part of Japanese planning. Much of Japan's sugar was grown here. The Suntory Distilling Company made whiskey here. The Japanese built roads and railroads, grew corn and vegetables, and by the time war broke out, the islands were thoroughly Japanized. The houses, language, culture, and most of the people were Japanese, so the Americans could expect to find people here who would fight for their homeland. Saipan, the most important of the objectives, because the Army Air Forces wanted it for a B-29 base, is 13 miles long and 5 miles wide at its widest point, about the size of Nantucket Island off Massachusetts. In the middle of the island at its widest point lies Mount Tapochau, which rises 1,500 feet above sea level. At the southern end was Aslito Airfield, Japan's major military staging airbase for planes going south and the most important field between Tokyo and Truk. Tinian is a smaller island, lying in the shadow of Saipan and quite visible from the larger island. It is less than 3 miles away across the channel. It was an important factor in the Japanese defense of Saipan, with 4 airfields. During the American planning for the seizure of the Marianas, Admiral Turner had gone over every detail. The objective, he said, was to take the Marianas to control sea communications through the Central Pacific for the support of further attacks on the Japanese. To do this was going to be difficult, as General Holland Smith could see. The east coast of Saipan was mostly free of reef, except around Magicienne Bay, but the beaches were narrow and rose up sharply to rugged heights, which meant the defenders had an enormous natural advantage. The west coast seemed much easier, with flat beaches and gently sloping land. The catch was that the whole west coast was surrounded by a barrier reef, except at 2 points, a channel off Charankanoa, a small town surrounded by sugar fields and sugar mills, and Tanapag Harbour, which served the big town of Garapan. After much discussion, Admiral Turner and his staff decided they would choose the more constricted west side of the island. They were to go in over the reef, as they had learned to do at the Gilberts and Marshalls. The 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions would land side by side around Charankanoa, drive across the island, then capture Aslito Airfield. After that, they would turn northeast and drive the Japanese up the island. This, as everyone knew, would be almost as difficult as the original landing, because the central and northern parts of the island were extremely mountainous. On June 15th, the operation would begin with a feint. The reserves would pretend to make a landing 4 miles north of the real beaches, hoping to draw the Japanese defenders to that area in force. Landing craft would be run in to within 4 miles of the beach. The American carrier strike of June 11th against the Marianas destroyed an estimated 82 planes at Saipan and Tinian and 25 at Guam. From that point on, the carrier force was shadowed by Japanese planes, but no attacks were launched. The next day, the carrier planes struck again and destroyed another 17 Japanese aircraft. The American losses were 12 fighters and 8 bombers. On the morning of June 13th, Admiral Lee left the task force with most of the battleships and cruisers to begin the 2-day naval bombardment of Saipan. The carriers continued to harry various islands in the Marianas, and land-based planes all over the South and Central Pacific struck at Palau, Truk, and other air bases to keep the Japanese from mounting any massive air relief. On the night of June 13th, the submarine Bofin reported that the Japanese fleet was on the prowl. She had encountered 4 battleships, 6 carriers, and 8 cruisers accompanied by a number of destroyers in Philippine waters. So Admirals Spruance and Mitcher knew the enemy was seeking a naval battle. On June 14th, Admiral Mitcher sent 2 task groups to Iwo Jima to strike airfields there and prevent the Japanese from bringing reinforcements down the island chain from Japan. But the carrier groups were warned that the Japanese fleet might appear in Marianas waters on June 17th, and they must be ready for a quick run-back if needed. Back at Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nimitz, who had copies of all these messages, asked General MacArthur to widen the search patterns of his land-based heavy bombers and scout planes to try to find and track the Japanese fleet. Nimitz never missed a bet in matters of this sort. He chose his commanders, let them have their heads, but watched every move, and if anything was undone, he made sure the necessary action was taken before the omission became an error. The carrier planes learned one new fact at Tinian and Saipan. The Japanese were very good anti-aircraft gunners when given the weapons. Around these major Japanese air bases, they had rings of guns, and the American plane casualties were mostly due to anti-aircraft fire. Planes from the Lexington's air group suffered badly. Lieutenant Commander Robert Isley, the group's bomber commander, went in to attack Aslito airfield with a new technique, wing rockets. He was shot down, and so was another TBM pilot. The reaction of the carrier officers was to abandon the rockets as not useful for the relatively slow torpedo bombers. But the fact was that the new carriers had been having the war so much their own way until the Marianas that they were not used to effective opposition. The bombardment fleet also encountered something new. At the Marshalls, the ships had stood offshore and peppered the land as they pleased. At Saipan, the Japanese shore guns began firing back. The destroyer Brain was severely damaged by a 6-inch shell. The battleship California's main battery director was knocked out by a 5-inch shell. The cruisers Birmingham and Indianapolis were also hit by shore gunfire, though neither was seriously damaged. The bombardment on June 13th by the new fast battleships was not very successful. They did not know the technique. But on the 14th, Admiral Oldendorf's old battleships and accompanying cruisers came up and did a better job. They had the experience and were effective at blowing up roads and knocking out some enemy installations. On the whole, however, the bombardment could not be as effective as it had been in the Marshalls for the simple reason that Saipan was too large an area, and they also had to work over Tinian. The Marianas, from the outset, represented a new challenge to the amphibious forces. On the morning of June 15th, the transports carrying the expedition's reserve troops moved in off Tanapag Harbour, and the landing craft began buzzing about in what seemed to be an attempt to land there. But after the landing force had come in to within its prescribed 4 miles from the beach, the craft turned about and headed back to the ships. If the Japanese were fooled, they gave little evidence, for they did not fire on the decoys. Later in the day, however, Radio Tokyo broadcast that the Americans had tried to land off Garapan and had been thrown back into the sea by the stout defenders of His Majesty's Empire. Radio Tokyo had very little to say about what was happening elsewhere along the beach. The relative importance of the Marianas to Japan was indicated in the ranks of the officers chosen for its defences. The senior of these was Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commander of Japan's carrier force at the Battle of Midway, whose failure there had caused him to be demoted to a defensive command where the Japanese expected never to have to make a defence. The defence of the Marianas, however, was not regarded primarily as a naval matter, as were the defences of all the island outposts outside the empire's inner perimeter. Saipan was Japanese soil, and the land area was large enough for the army to manoeuvre, so it was primarily an army command, a part of the area of Lieutenant General Hideyoshi Obata, whose headquarters was located on Palau. The Saipan army garrison was under the command of Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito. The Americans made one serious mistake at Saipan. They underestimated the number of Japanese defenders on the island by more than half. The US estimate suggested that Saipan would house about 15,000 defenders, including several thousand construction workers. In fact, there were more than 30,000 soldiers and sailors on Saipan. The Americans never did discover the exact number, for reasons that will become apparent, but the error in intelligence was costly in time and the effectiveness of the American battle plan. One reason for so great an error was Japan's hasty effort to shore up the Marianas' perimeter after the fall of the Marshalls. A Japanese transport carrying 4,100 troops was dispatched from the homeland in February, but was sunk. None of those men ever reached Saipan. About half arrived in Guam, confusing that picture too. Early in June, the army sent a 7-ship convoy to Saipan to reinforce the garrison. 5 of the ships were sunk by American submarines, and there was no accurate count of the survivors. There were also many survivors of other sinkings who had not yet been moved back to Japan. But survivors do not make an army, and this was the major problem that General Saito faced. After the Marshalls' invasion, when Admiral Ogaki moved the combined fleet headquarters, the 6th Fleet, submarines, moved its headquarters to Saipan, and General Saito was constantly complaining to Admiral Takagi, the submarine commander, that he could not provide a defence if Takagi kept letting the American submarines sink the supply ships. Most of the survivors of such sinkings arrived on Saipan with little more than the clothes they wore. Saito had issued a call for construction materials and heavy weapons, and complained bitterly that he did not receive them because of the sinkings. The result was that General Saito's defences were totally inadequate for the island. He had only 8 6-inch guns, 17 smaller field guns, and a few mortars. His plans called for a far stronger defence, dozens of guns, and scores of pillboxes and highly fortified blockhouses. However, the Americans had moved so rapidly since the fall of 1943 that these had never been built. American submarines were responsible for that failure. One of the main lines of defence for the island was to be Admiral Takagi's submarine force. 8 Japanese submarines were stationed on a picket line east and southeast of Guam, 10 were strung out east of Saipan, and 2 more were stationed to the west. They were supposed to watch for the appearance of an American fleet and give plenty of warning to the islands and Admiral Toyoda so the AGO plan could be put into effect. But American warships interfered. The most effective interference was by Commander Samuel Dealey in the submarine Harder. On the night of June 6th, the Harder came across 3 big transports guarded by 2 destroyers near Taui Taui, the Japanese base. He sank the destroyer Minazuki that night. The next morning, the Japanese conducted an intensive search for the submarine, and it was discovered by the destroyer Hayanami. Sam Dealey sank the Hayanami too. 2 days later, he fired on 2 more destroyers, sinking the Tanikaze and claiming a second, but it was apparently only damaged. A day later, he had another encounter and submerged hastily after firing several torpedoes. Inside the submarine, the crew heard torpedoes strike and the sounds of a ship breaking up, but no records were found to substantiate a sinking there. General Obata had told his subordinates earlier to convert Saipan into an invulnerable fortress. Like so many declarations from higher commands, the plan was separated from reality by a deficiency in force. The coastal defences had been completed before June. 5 gun positions guarded the approaches to these beaches between Agingan and Marpi points. 1 120 mm gun and 1 150 mm gun were placed to hit targets off the northwest coast. Marpi Point had a battery of 40 mm guns. Magicienne Bay was protected by 4 batteries, including 200 guns. Nafutan Point had two 150 guns. There were many dual-purpose anti-aircraft guns, which could be trained on surface targets. As the generals had promised, the finest fighting troops were entrenched along the beaches. Behind them were tanks on the edge of the mountains and more troops. General Obata had prepared a second line of defense, and behind the second line, the Japanese had scouted out caves, thickets, and deep ravines, which would be used defensively if all else failed. The plan had been to build up every available position, but the shortage of materials in the winter of 1943-44 and the speed with which the Americans were moving had prevented General Obata from achieving his goals. He had come perhaps halfway along in his plan. Although Admiral Nagumo, called the hero of Pearl Harbor before Midway's disaster, was the senior officer present, the defense of Saipan was to be an army matter largely because there were 25,500 soldiers on the island and only 6,000 sailors. There was no trouble about that. Admiral Nagumo yielded gracefully to General Saito, and Saito was in command. He divided Saipan into 4 sectors, 3 under the Army and the 4th under the Navy. The northern sector was protected by the 135th Infantry Regiment. The Navy's 5th Special Base Force was responsible for the area around Garapan, including Mount Tapachao, the highest point on the island. Among the naval contingent were men of the 55th Guard Force and the equivalent to the Marines, the Yokosuka 1st Special Naval Landing Force. Beyond them in the landing area were troops of the 136th Infantry Regiment. Back in the hills were the artillery, the anti-aircraft units, and a mixed bag of survivors of sunken ships and stranded soldiers. On June 10th, the USS Taylor discovered the Japanese submarine RO-3 on the surface and sank her. 3 days later, the destroyer Melvin discovered the RO-36 and sank her. Before the Americans ever reached Saipan waters, the naval defensive ring had been shattered, and communications between Takagi and his submarines were lost. This was partly the fault of the Navy. Takagi had moved to Saipan without adequate communications facilities. It was partly the fortunes of war. The Americans had prevented the shipment of new communications facilities, and the weather turned bad for Admiral Takagi. But whatever the reasons, the result was that contact with that American force seen at Majuro was lost, and the intensive activity around Tawi-Tawi indicated that the Americans might be moving in the south, which added to the Japanese confusion. By June 13th, when reports of the ship bombardment of Saipan and Tinian were available, it was too late to do much about any defences except air. Still, as the American fleet lay offshore on June 15th, and the invasion troops moved into their landing craft, General Saito had but one order for his defenders. "Destroy the enemy on the beach," he said. How that was to be done he did not indicate. Everyone concerned, from General Holland Smith down to the last Marine private, had worries about the landing on Saipan. It was the largest landing to date, and the conditions were anything but ideal. The Marines had to go in over a reef that in some places was 700 yards across, and 8,000 of them were supposed to be ashore on a beach 3.5 miles long within the first hour. The reef side of the island had been chosen because of those beaches, and the fact that behind them was relatively flat land, rather than the steep hills of the other side. On the day before the assault, underwater demolition teams had scoured the area and reported it was clear, free of man-made obstacles. Small boats came in to plant buoys that would guide the landing craft in along the lanes established on paper. That night, the Japanese came out in small boats and planted flags in the area between the reef edge and the beaches to help guide their machine gun fire and mortars when the Americans landed the next day. The Japanese artillery, back in the hills, was already zeroed in on the beaches. Very early in the morning, the Americans formed up. As the transports moved over to Tanapag Harbour to try their bluff, the assault forces that would carry the 2nd and 4th Marines into land began making ready. At 5:20 they were on station. Admiral Turner ordered the landings to begin at 8:40. For the next 3 hours, the preparatory bombardment brought man-made thunder and lightning to the island. The naval barrage continued until 7 o'clock, with 2 battleships, 2 cruisers, and 6 destroyers throwing shells over the heads of the Marines onto the beaches. The Marines moved out of the LSTs and transports into the small landing craft, and the little boats bobbed and pitched in the sea. The Marines watched the spouts of sand go up as shells hit on the beach and the palm trees splinter as they were struck. At 7 o'clock the thunder ended, and then bombers from the escort carriers came in to swoop down and plaster the beaches with high explosives. Sand and smoke filled the air, and for a few moments the beach was obscured. By H-hour minus 30 minutes, the Marines were in their boats, which jockeyed around, waiting for the signal to move in. Behind them, the naval bombardment began again. The battleships concentrated on Agingen Point, which would be at the right end of the Marine line, on Mucho Point at the other end, and on Afetna Point in the middle. The first wave would contain nearly 100 LVTs, landing vehicle tank, and nearly 70 armoured amphibious tractors, those AMPH tracks for which Holland Smith had fought so hard after the difficulties at Batio. They could go in over the reef and carry the men up onto the beaches. Ahead of all were 24 LCI gunboats which would rake the beaches one more time with gunfire and rockets before the troops landed. Behind them were the second and third waves of troops, and out beyond them were the reserves, who would be brought in by the landing craft on a second trip. At 8:12 that morning, the first wave began to move. General Watson's 2nd Marine Division would attack on the left. The 6th Marine Regiment would take Beaches Red 2 and Red 3. The 8th Marines would take Beaches Green 1 and Green 2, which would put them on the beach just north of Afetna Point. South of the point, the 4th Marine Division would land, the 23rd Marines on Beaches Blue 1 and Blue 2, and the 25th Marines on Beaches Yellow 1 and Yellow 2. Each battalion would have a 600-yard front, which took the 4th Division down almost to Agingen Point. As the landing craft moved inward, a final assault was made by the planes of the escort carriers, fighters this time. They flew in at treetop level to strafe, scaring the Marines half to death as they came over the landing craft, and the shell casings from their machine guns fell red-hot into the boats. Some Marines thought they were under attack from their own planes. A taste of what was to come began to filter through the haze and smoke as a handful of Japanese shells burst near the line of departure of the amphibious tractors and landing craft. They did little damage. The awesome bombardment and airstrikes seemed much more significant. But at the Marshalls, the Japanese had not used their artillery so early in the game. The geysers in the water gave an indication that this invasion was not to be the same, and the marine observer flying above the island in a grasshopper observation plane radioed down to the men in the boats, "This is not like the Marshalls, not at all." Robert Sherrod, correspondent for life, who had been at Tarawa, scribbled in his notebook, "I fear all this smoke and noise does not mean many Japanese killed." But the tractors pushed ahead. The battleships and cruisers and destroyers continued to fire, and as the landing craft reached a point 300 yards from the beach, they shifted their fire to the obvious strong points, Afetna Point in particular. The carrier planes continued to strafe along the beaches and would until the Marines were ashore, trying to be careful to stay 100 yards from the beach itself. In the landing craft, the Marines waited nervously. Some smoked and kept their heads down. One man got sick on the steel deck. A few appeared to be reading paperback books, but their buddies would have bet no one was remembering what they read. The tractors bucked up and down in the choppy sea. There was a stir when they were halfway in. The Japanese fire became heavier, and the word was passed to a battalion of the 23rd Marines not to land on Blue Beach 1, as planned, but on Blue Beach 2, where the fire was less, or seemed less. So the Marines, those who had been at Tarawa and at Kwajalein and Eniwetok, knew very well that the observer overhead knew what he was talking about. It was not going to be like the Marshalls, not at all. The Marines did not know it, but General Saito had planned to expend 15% of his ammunition on the landing. The approaching landing craft, and another 15% on the landing force after it hit the beaches. So when the Americans hit the 300-yard mark, the shells were coming thick and fast, and they seemed to have a pattern. Every 25 yards the boats went in, every 15 seconds. Another shell would burst. A few Marines stuck their heads up over the sides of the tractors. They saw that some of the amphibious tractors had been hit and flopped over. But at 8:43, the first wave hit Beach Red 2, and within 8 minutes there were troops on every beach. The 2nd Marine Division had landed out of position. The landing craft were pulled by a strong current, and the drivers faced deadly fire on the left. The 6th Marine Regiment and the 8th got jammed up, and the troops were concentrated on beaches Red 2, Red 3 and Green 1, which gave the Japanese a massive target. The casualties in these first minutes were heavy. Down the beach, the 4th Marines were more fortunate on the other side of Afetna Point and landed in a more orderly fashion. They were supposed to push forward and overrun Agingan Point, Charan Kanoa and the ridgeline above, but the Japanese fire prevented a coordinated attack. Some troops were stuck on the beaches under fire, and the attack began to bog down. This could be fatal. Coming in, the amphibious tractors began firing with their cannons and machine guns, but they were firing at areas, not at troops, for they could see virtually no Japanese. One machine gunner turned to a buddy. "It gives me the creeps," he said, "like fighting a bunch of ghosts." Then he turned back to his weapon and did what he had been told to do. Rake the trees up ahead. They might be full of Japanese snipers. The 6th Marine attack stalled about 100 yards inland under the pressure of Japanese machine gun fire and shell fire. The captured sand was unrecognizable as a sloping beach. The shells and bombs of the morning had torn huge craters in the sand, and smashed and burned out amphibious tractors littered the beach. Behind them, in the little shelter they gave, the wounded lay awaiting evacuation. A few yards inland, a Japanese tank lay among the American vehicles, apparently abandoned. But after the first wave had passed, and the reserve 1st Battalion of the 6th Marines was coming into shore, the tank suddenly came to life and began firing on the amphibious tractors. Lieutenant Colonel William K. Jones sent up a rocket launcher and riflemen with grenades. They fired, and the tank erupted in smoke and flame. This time it was abandoned by all the living Japanese. Ahead, the going was very difficult for the 3rd Battalion of the 6th Marines. Machine guns fired on them, causing them to stay low. Up on the ridge behind, spotters called for mortar fire, and it began to arrive, the kind of fire that ducking did not help. The Marines were waiting for banzai charges, but they did not see any. Once in a while they saw a Japanese figure rise, fire a rifle and duck down. But General Saito had ordained a defence in depth. There would be no banzai charges, not yet. The Marines had been on the beach about an hour when the Japanese infantrymen staged a counterattack. 24 grey-green uniforms appeared as Colonel James Risley was establishing his command post on Beach Red 2. The enemy knew the command post was important. If they could knock it out, they could confuse the American attack. But the Marines were ready. The Japanese came forward stubbornly, and the defenders cut them down with M1 rifles and machine guns. In this sort of attack, the enormous firepower of a dozen M1 semi-automatic rifles made all the difference. At noon, the Japanese sent 2 tanks down from the foothills to help stem the advance. But the commander of the tanks became disoriented, perhaps by a landscape quite changed with the destruction of the morning, and stopped shortly after he had passed through the American forward line. The turret hatch of the leading tank popped open, and a Japanese helmet came up. The commander was having a look around. Stopping was his first mistake. The Marines brought up rocket launchers and rifle grenadiers, and they made quick work of the 2 tanks. Early in the afternoon, the Japanese tried again to thrust the landing force back into the sea. 3 more tanks came down, headed for Risley's command post. 2 were stopped by rockets and grenades before they reached the line, but the 3rd came on and reached a point 15 yards from the command post before the Marines could smash it. The constant artillery and mortar fire from the defence line was extremely effective. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Colonel Risley estimated that 35% of the regiment were casualties. It was apparent that the Japanese had a strong force up ahead. But the Marines had expanded the beachhead, and it extended 400 yards inland in a place or two. Risley tried an assault on the ridgeline ahead, where the Japanese mortars lay, but it was thrown back. The reserves were needed to hold the positions they had taken. On the right of the 6th Marines, the 8th Marines were to take the Green Beaches and Afetna Point, the Japanese stronghold. Lieutenant Colonel H.P. Crow's 2nd Battalion and Lieutenant Colonel John C. Miller Jr.'s 3rd Battalion were supposed to land on different beaches, but the current and crossfire had brought them both to Green 1. The sorting out of companies took a little doing, but it was done, and soon the Marines were fanning out to attack the positions assigned. At this point, the Charan Kanoa airstrip came very near the sea, and the strip was a point to be taken by Crow's battalion. They advanced along the strip edge toward Afetna Point and were met by Japanese riflemen firing across the runway from prepared positions on the other side. On the edge of Afetna Point stood 9 small field guns, which were trained on the beaches. The Japanese fired on the incoming amphibious tractors, and when the Americans began to approach from their flank, they continued to fire on the boats. The Marines cut the gun crews down one by one. Until noon, there was still considerable confusion, with heavy mortar and artillery fire concentrated on the red and green beaches. Shortly after noon, however, Brigadier General Merritt Edson, Assistant Division Commander of the 2nd Division, came ashore to visit the command post of the 8th Marines, and correspondent Sherrod came with him. Later, Sherrod wrote a description of what he saw, a word picture of death and destruction. At one point on the beach, he counted 17 dead Marines within a few yards, many of them in that position so common in warfare, fallen as they ran forward, sprawled with arms and gun outstretched and legs tucked beneath them. He saw dead Japanese defenders, wrecked amphibious tractors, an abandoned Japanese field gun, and ammunition carts. He saw a goat sitting under the front of an abandoned amphibious tractor. Around him and up front was the popping of guns, the heavier noise of artillery fire, and the plopping of mortars. And there was the goat, a white goat, looking up at him. Up near the command post, Colonel Wallace was directing the advance of his troops. The fighting was vigorous, and the commanders of both assault battalions were wounded that day and had to be evacuated. The regimental reserve, the 1st Battalion, was ordered ashore almost as soon as the assault battalions got their feet dry. Early in the afternoon, the division reserve was committed here too, for the capture of Afetna Point was that important. The real problem was effective Japanese artillery fire, which prevented the troops from moving inland. The 8th Marines battled inland to the swamps below the point, but could go no further. In mid-afternoon, Colonel Wallace assessed his situation. He had lost 35% of his effective troops too. On the south side of Afetna Point, the 23rd Marines attacked on the Blue Beaches. Here the amphibious tractors went straight ashore and kept on going. They advanced up to the road that led to Charan Kanoa, a village of single-story white concrete buildings ablaze with bougainvillea. Soon they were in the town, which had been badly mauled by naval gunfire. They were fired on by snipers from the ditches, but went on through, past a baseball diamond and a Buddhist temple. They were heading for the ridge a mile away, which was a key to the Japanese defences. The advance troops reached Mount Fina Susu, which stood out from the ridge, and occupied the hill. The trouble was that this hill was totally exposed to Japanese fire from behind, and the Marines were under fire all day. Other troops were supposed to come up from the road to help, but instead of bringing up the amphibious tractors, which carried cannon that might be useful, the troops came up on foot. They held the hill all day, but at night they were ordered to pull back. The troops who were supposed to come up on the flanks had not made it that day. On the north, the swamps of Lake Susupe had stalled them, and on the south, the troops had run into a sharp incline, not visible on the aerial photographs, which had stopped the amphibious tractors cold. On the yellow beaches, Colonel Morton Batchelder's 25th Marines landed in a barrage of enemy artillery fire. One amphibious tractor after another was hit and stopped. Only half of them finally reached the railroad embankment, an objective that ran diagonally inland, 500 yards from the shore at its nearest point. The Japanese artillery fire continued to be heavy, and so was fire from a pair of mortars that had been bypassed near the beach and now turned on the rear of the Americans. The mortars were silenced by a strike from one of the escort carriers offshore. On the south, where the 1st Battalion landed, the Americans came under heavy enfilade fire from Ugingan Point, which was the focus of Japanese resistance in this area. The whole position was heavily fortified, and a number of artillery pieces kept firing on the beach. Less than an hour after the troops were ashore, the Japanese heightened the barrage, and then an infantry unit counterattacked, hoping to push the Marines back into the sea. But the battalion commander called for an airstrike and support from Navy guns on the point, and this helped stop the counterattack. That first Japanese counterattack came at 9:30 in the morning. A second was launched early in the afternoon, involving 2 companies of Japanese troops. They attacked against the 25th's flank and threatened the whole position on the beach. But the Marines brought up tanks from the 4th Tank Battalion, and they drove the Japanese back. Many of the defenders were killed in this foray, and the remainder retreated into spiderweb fortifications of the sort that the Americans had encountered in the Marshalls. All afternoon, the Marines routed them out, and by the end of the day, one company reported that it alone had killed 150 Japanese. As the day lengthened, the tanks became more evident and more useful. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the 2nd Tank Battalion was ashore, and one company of 14 tanks played a decisive role in destroying Japanese defences at Afetna Point. It was not an easy job. 8 of the tanks of the company were damaged at some point, and one was put out of action altogether. When the 4th Tank Battalion landed, several tanks were stopped by short-circuiting of their electrical systems. Seawater had gotten in. Company B's tanks were split up. Some were sent to the blue beaches and some to the green. Half a dozen were lost in deep water. Only Company C, which landed on the yellow beaches, managed to get all its tanks ashore safely. The artillery was supposed to come ashore on the first day, and several pack howitzers were brought in. However, the 105 mm guns did not arrive until very late in the day. The casualty rate of the artillerymen was so high that on the blue beaches, 3 75 mm howitzer batteries were merged into 2. When the 105s did arrive, 4 of them were hit almost immediately by Japanese mortar fire, causing more time to be lost in repairing the guns. As evening neared, many Japanese guns had been silenced, but the beach was littered with AMF tracks, dead Marines, and knocked-out tanks. The Japanese continued their shelling of the beaches, and the casualties among the Marines rose. The wounded were often hit again by artillery and mortar fire as they lay beneath wrecked vehicles or in the shelter of wrecked enemy defences. Many who had survived one wound died from another, incurred as they awaited transportation back to the ships. One estimate at the end of the first day put the casualty toll of the Marines at 2,000. By the time night fell at the end of D-Day, the Marines were ashore and established, but they had not accomplished their plan. The enemy still held half the territory they had hoped to occupy by day's end, and their presence on the ridges above the beaches constituted a serious threat. The 2nd Division held a line from the coast, about a mile south of Garapan, to the middle of Afetna Point. Its deepest penetration inland was about 2/3 of a mile. However, the position was regarded as well enough established that General Thomas E. Watson came ashore and established his command post in a captured ammunition dump on the inland side of the coastal road. The 4th Division had moved forward during the day to the ridgeline, but the salient had to be withdrawn with nightfall to avoid the Marines being surrounded during the night. The Japanese were still entrenched on Aging Point, but General Harry Schmidt had moved his command post ashore as well. The Marines planned to stay. As night fell, the Japanese planned to counterattack. They slipped down from the ridges and moved toward the American lines in small groups. From their concealed positions in the hills, Japanese tanks came forward, with troops joining behind them. The major attack was aimed at the 6th Marines. They had dug in for the night and were in their foxholes when the sounds of movement warned them that the enemy was coming. At 3:30 in the morning, the enemy moved and within a few minutes had overrun 160 mm mortar position. A tank passed right over another foxhole occupied by mortarmen, dripping oil on the Marines as it went by. In 15 minutes, the tanks had penetrated deep behind the Marines' line, but this did not prove to be totally beneficial to the Japanese attack. The Marines stayed in their tank-proof foxholes and attacked the vulnerable rear ends of the tanks after they had passed. One Marine with a bazooka disabled 4 tanks that way. The Japanese tanks continued forward, with the infantry behind them, and some stalled. The tank troops would jump out, inspect their vehicle, clang their long swords on the metal, and make fearsome noises. The Marines responded with grenades and machine gun fire, mowing them down. One pair of Marines, Private First Class Charles D. Merritt and Private First Class Herbert J. Hodges, took their bazookas around on a tour, firing at 7 tanks and hitting all 7. When the tank and infantry attack began, the Marines called for help from the Navy, and soon star shells began illuminating the perimeter of the 6th Marines. The battleship California fired at the base of the ridge to halt tank reinforcements. Reinforcement came up from the beachhead to help the beleaguered battalion, and a platoon of American medium tanks rumbled up. By morning, the fighting was intense, as the Japanese had sent a battalion of the 136th Infantry to drive the Marines back. But the drive failed, and when the last stalled tank had been investigated to ensure there were no living Japanese inside, the Japanese casualty count came to more than 700. All along the line, the Japanese made some effort that first night to halt the American invasion. The 8th Marines were harried by attacks along the front of the swamp that marked their perimeter, but the swamp inhibited the Japanese attack as much as it had the Marine attempts the day before. The 25th Marines were hit by a counter-attack at 3:30. At first they saw a party of civilians coming toward them, hands up, asking for refuge from the fighting. But immediately behind the refugees were Japanese riflemen. The Marines' sympathy evaporated, and they called in artillery to support the ground troops. The 105s were ashore by that time, and they put down a very effective barrage that ended the civilian effort. During the fighting, a Japanese shell set fire to a self-propelled 75 mm gun, which lit up the area. When the ammunition in the vehicle began to explode, the Marines had to move back 200 yards, but they held their position. As dawn broke, the front quieted down. The Japanese had tried their best, but failed to dislodge the Marines from the beachhead. The Chief of Staff of the defending forces reported to General Saito that their efforts had not been successful. However, he was not dismayed. He said the troops would reorganize during the morning and attack again. The Eigo plan had been activated. Admiral Ozawa was on his way with the Japanese fleet to destroy the American force at sea. From the Japanese carriers and from the air bases at Tinian, Rota, Guam, and the Palais, the indomitable Japanese airmen would rise and strike the enemy. And on Saipan, as the American fleet and air arm were destroyed, the soldiers would mass and drive the miserable remnants of the Marines back into the sea to drown. Tenno Heika Banzai. May the Emperor live 10,000 years. Admiral Ozawa was a brilliant naval officer. From Japan's point of view, his conduct from the beginning of the war had been irreproachable. He had commanded the Japanese forces that assured the capture of Malaya and led in the destruction of the remnants of the American Asiatic fleet in the waters of the Dutch East Indies. When Admiral Nagumo had been disgraced by the failure at Midway and exiled to Saipan, Admiral Ozawa had been promoted to command the carrier force. In the changes made since the Americans began charging across the Pacific, Ozawa had also gained command of the 1st Mobile Fleet, the Japanese euphemism for the remainder of the once mighty combined fleet. On the morning of June 15th, as the Americans began streaming ashore on Saipan, Admiral Ozawa was aboard his flagship Taiho at the entrance to Guimaras Strait, waiting for the Mobile Fleet to complete fueling and for some word about the whereabouts of the Americans. The loss of so many of Admiral Takagi's submarines had dealt a serious blow to Admiral Ozawa's intelligence system. The single-engine float planes and 4-engine flying boats used for observation too often did not make it back to base, so full of American aircraft were the skies these days. But on June 15th, Admiral Ozawa did not need that sort of intelligence. Admiral Nagumo had the word for him. The American fleet was at Saipan. Just before 9 o'clock that morning, the Admiral approved a message to the fleet, sent to every commanding officer of every vessel, from the proud Taiho, which was second in carrier size only to the American Saratoga, down to the last oiler, on whose services Admiral Ozawa depended for survival. The Navy had emptied its barrels for this operation. The amount of refined fuel given the fleet was far in excess of its ration. Earlier, Tokyo had said the fleet must stay in Indonesian waters and burn unrefined crude oil for maneuvers, so serious was the shortage of refined oil. But Operation Eigo was considered so important at the highest levels that Admiral Ozawa could have anything Japan could give him. Eigo was the Navy's last great hope. If it worked to perfection, the American carrier force would be wiped out, and the American drive across the Pacific set back at least a year or two. In that time, Japan could augment its naval forces, completing those ships already on the way. No senior Japanese officer liked to consider the future. Those who remembered Admiral Yamamoto's pre-Pearl Harbor warnings about the long-term American potential for production of war materials knew that Japan's dream of an Asian and Pacific superempire had vanished. But even the most conservative officers had hope that Operation Eigo would bring a victory that would lead to a respite and, in turn, an honourable peace. A strong enemy force began landing operations in the Saipan Tinian area. The combined fleet will attack the enemy in the Marianas area and annihilate the invasion force. This was Admiral Toyoda's message to Admiral Ozawa that morning. The fueling process was stopped. The fleet sailed, heading eastwards. Admiral Ugaki's battleships and cruisers were coming up east of the Philippines, and Ozawa would meet them and fuel them. On June 16th and 17, the two forces topped off their tanks, and the tankers set course for a rendezvous point. Admiral Ozawa's intelligence about the enemy was much better than the Americans knew. He was aware that 4 carrier groups were involved, and that the landing force on Saipan was heavily protected by escort carriers, and seemed to have its own battleships and cruisers. The fleet he would engage then was Admiral Mitcher's carrier force, and he knew it was Mitcher in command. He also knew that the commander of the whole fleet was Admiral Spruance, and so Ozawa felt no concern about being surprised. Spruance's reputation for extreme conservatism had spread to Japan. Ozawa knew that Spruance would never let the carriers loose to attack outside the Saipan area, so he would have the advantage of the initiative. By nightfall on June 17th, Admiral Ozawa had a good picture of the American disposition, acquired by the risk of sending out 16 seaplanes, 13 fighters, and 13 bombers to observe enemy activity. They counted 7 fleet carriers, 8 light carriers, 14 escort carriers, 14 battleships, 10 heavy cruisers, 15 light cruisers, and 86 destroyers. Here was the American fleet. If Admiral Ozawa could execute the Eigo plan, its power would be destroyed. The basic assumption of the Eigo plan was that the Mariana Islands themselves provided Japan with the material for victory. To be sure, the Americans had 15 aircraft carriers of various sorts, as opposed to Ozawa's 9. They had 1,000 carrier planes, as opposed to Ozawa's 430. But Saipan's and Tinian's airstrips were better than carriers, and made up for the difference. If one counted the 500 aircraft shipped into the area by Imperial headquarters in the past 2 months, it was easy to see, from a Japanese perspective, that the statistical edge of the American fleet was not nearly as significant as it appeared. If one added the Bushido spirit, which made every pilot a hero, then one could say, from a Japanese viewpoint, that victory was certain. That was the official view. In Tokyo, at Imperial headquarters, admirals and generals were telling one another quite seriously that the American invasion of Saipan did not really matter, for as soon as Ozawa had disposed of the carrier fleet, the army would drive the invaders into the sea. There was the question of aircraft, a little troubling to the Japanese. They had developed radar for their planes, but few were yet equipped with it, and even fewer of the pilots knew how to use it. That was the main trouble at this moment, the lack of skilled pilots. There simply had been no respite from the Americans since Guadalcanal, so the losses suffered at Midway were never made up. Each time a class of pilots graduated from a flying school, most of the class was rushed down to the South Pacific to replace men lost, and most of these pilots, too, were lost. On the face of it, that was a fatal difficulty. But again, the senior officers of Japan's armed forces comforted themselves by believing that superior dedication, Bushido again, at least compensated for inferior training. There were some realists in the Japanese military ranks, but they were not encouraged to air their views, and if they were so impolite as to press objections, they would find themselves reduced to some position where they were not heard. On the positive side, Admiral Ozawa's light, unarmoured planes had a flight range of nearly 600 miles, while the American range was closer to 300. That difference meant that with any luck, Ozawa was certain to know where his enemy lay and be able to launch a strike against him, perhaps hours before the Americans had any indication of his fleet's position. This first strike capability could be the difference between victory and defeat. If coupled with assistance from the land-based planes on Saipan, Tinian, Rota, and Guam, a first strike could knock the Americans out before they found the Japanese fleet. Ozawa had one advantage that applied to carriers, in a way that it had not applied to modern navies since the sailing days. He had the weather gauge. The eastern trade winds were blowing at his bows as he headed toward the American fleet. He would not have to circle about to launch planes into the wind, which Admiral Mitcher would have to do. That meant precious minutes saved, which again could make all the difference. And there was one other advantage. As searchers of these waters, the Japanese were extremely effective, a fact already proved in the amount of intelligence Admiral Ozawa had. The search planes were launched all morning on June 18th. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Admiral Ozawa's fleet had reached a point 500 miles west of Saipan and had landed several of the Type 92 fighters, Tenzan torpedo bombers, and Suisei bombers, all bearing bits of information that indicated his enemy was about 150 miles west of Saipan, steaming toward him. Half an hour later, Rear Admiral Sueo Obayashi, commander of Carrier Division 3, suggested that they launch a preemptive strike that afternoon. He was so eager and so sure that Admiral Ozawa would proceed that he began launching planes after sending his message. But Ozawa ordered Obayashi to stop launching and recall his planes. It was too late in the day for his planes to attack the Americans and return to the carriers. They would have to land on the islands of the Marianas, and that meant there would be fewer aircraft for the dawn strike that Ozawa now planned. He wanted that first blow to be aimed at a knockout. Admiral Ozawa headed south then, instead of continuing his eastward course. Thus he would preserve the distance factor to his advantage, and the next day launch planes again as he moved toward the enemy. He sent the major part of his fleet due east still, but the 6 largest carriers headed south. Late that night, Admiral Ozawa broke radio silence to communicate with Vice Admiral Kakuta on Tinian, commander of the land-based air forces in the Marianas. He announced, in code of course, that he was preparing to strike in the morning and called on Kakuta for supportive action from the land. That night, Admiral Ozawa found his fleet in an area of squalls. Low clouds hung over the carriers, which was certainly a defensive advantage, but if they extended west to the enemy, it was also a disadvantage. An hour before dawn, he dispatched a group of 16 seaplanes to scout out the enemy. A second group of 14 planes and a third of 11 bombers were launched within the hour. Just after 7 o'clock in the morning, the scouts began to report. They had found the enemy in 3 groups, it seemed, with the nearest group 300 miles east of Obayashi's carriers. Admiral Ozawa gave the order to attack. Aboard the Taiho, the flight leaders had asked permission to speak to the admiral, and when it was granted, they came forth emotionally to announce their determination to wipe out the shame that had fallen on the carrier forces at Midway. They were going out to destroy the enemy this time, said Lieutenant Takashi Ibata, and they would bring Admiral Ozawa a victory on the wings of their triumphant planes. On the other carriers, the pilots were conducting similar little ceremonies. As well as any admiral, every pilot knew that this battle was to be their moment of decision, when the future of Japan rode in their cockpits. They were supremely confident that the superior Japanese spirit would triumph. So saying, the pilots manned their planes. At 7:30, The first attack wave of 48 fighters, 54 bombers, and 27 torpedo bombers was launched, and the formations assembled over the carriers. Admiral Ozawa stood on his flag bridge with his chief of staff, Captain Matake Yoshimura, and his senior staff officer, Captain Toshikazu Omai, and watched. They were very pleased, for they too expected a victory this day. If they did not get it, they also knew that the fleet was finished as a major arm of Japanese defence, and that the war, already lost, could not be turned around even enough to assure an honourable peace. Admiral Togo had overstated his case in May 1905 when he told the fleet, "The fate of the Empire rests on this one battle. Every man is expected to do his utmost." But when Admiral Toyoda repeated the statement 39 years later, he was not exaggerating, and when Admiral Ozawa transmitted the word to the fleet, every man sensed that somehow the fate of the Empire lay in his own hands. On June 15th, Admiral Spruance was waiting for the Japanese to show their hand. He had asked for more and longer searches from General MacArthur's land-based aircraft in the southwest Pacific, since he knew that a number of Japanese ships had been operating in the Biak area. General MacArthur obliged, but the planes did not find the Japanese fleet. Neither did those of the American fleet. Admiral Ozawa had anticipated this activity and had taken a route that kept him outside the range of American air search. Spruance's only reliable sources of information were reports from the American submarines scattered all over the area. The moment the Navy's fighting men had prayed for was approaching. From the American point of view, Saipan represented Midway in reverse. This time the Americans had the overwhelming advantage in ships. By assaulting Saipan in the inner ring of the Empire, they had lured the Japanese fleet out to fight, just as Admiral Yamamoto had done with the Americans in 1942. There was another similarity to Midway in a small way. The Japanese intelligence, with all the material deficiencies, was superior to the American. The fact is that as of 2 o'clock on the afternoon of June 15th, Admiral Spruance did not know where his enemy was, and Admiral Ozawa did know where the Americans were and how many of them there were. In every way, Japanese air reconnaissance was superior to American. The trouble was that there were so many reports and so little information. The Flying Fish reported a Japanese fleet coming out of San Bernardino Strait on the evening of June 15th. An hour later, the Seahorse reported a battleship force heading northeast of Surigao Strait. That meant the Japanese were in two forces, and to Spruance that meant trouble. The invasion of Guam had been set for June 18th. Spruance cancelled it. He did not want to have to protect two invasions at the same time. On the morning of June 16th, Admiral Spruance went to Admiral Turner's flagship, the Rocky Mount, to confer. They agreed that he should detach 8 cruisers and 21 destroyers for Turner, and then he was free to pursue the Japanese fleet. Turner was satisfied that with his own large force of old battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and 7 escort carriers, he could protect the landings from any Japanese attack other than that of the main carrier force. Since Spruance was going after the Japanese carriers, Turner was not worried. So on the morning of June 16th, Admiral Spruance seemed to have decided to take the initiative and destroy the Japanese fleet. He ordered his flagship, the Indianapolis, to sail out and join the carriers. Just after 2 o'clock on the afternoon of June 17th, Admiral Spruance issued a battle plan worthy of a Nelson. The carrier planes, he said, would first knock out the Japanese carriers' ability to operate. Then they would leave them as cripples, if not sunk, and attack enemy battleships and cruisers to disable them or slow them down. The battleship fleet would come up and destroy the enemy in a fleet action if the enemy elected to fight. If the enemy ran, Admiral Lee's battleships and cruisers would chase and sink the cripples. Action against the retreating enemy must be pushed vigorously by all hands to ensure complete destruction of his fleet. Admiral Mitcher was riding in Lexington, and when he had the stirring battle call from Spruance, he was elated. He asked, no one quite knew what to expect after the heavy bombardment that was supposed to soften up the Japanese on Roy Namur Island in the Marshalls. The landings were easier than expected, as this beach scene shows. At least the landing craft made the beach. The Marines called them Darlings, those torpedo bombers above on Roy Namur that bombed the enemy on request. Even after the landings, the carrier bombers continued to give air support. At least he could get his head up. The sand of Eniwetok was sprinkled with sticks and pieces of metal after the hammering by the bombers and the ships before the Marines landed. When the Marines came in, they advanced and rapidly. The Japanese died bravely. When the end came on Kwajalein and there was no further place to retreat, many followed the dictates of their officers and the Bushido Code and used their rifles or grenades to kill themselves rather than be captured. The men in charge. Once the Saipan beachhead was secured, General Thomas Watson, centre, moved his command post ashore. General Holland Smith, left, the commander of the land forces, came with Admiral Raymond Spruance, right, commander of the whole invasion force, to confer. When the Americans approached Saipan, they sent in the bombers first, then the fighters to strafe, and the naval ships offshore delivered the bombardment. As the first wave of Marines headed for the beach, the fires on the island were burning fiercely. Troops kept coming ashore on Saipan long after the beachhead was secured and the supplies built up. In the background lies Tinian Island, the second of the Marianas group to be attacked, just as soon as Saipan was secured. The small escort carriers stood offshore at Saipan during the landings, giving air protection to the troops ashore. In the first day or two, as night came, so did the Japanese bombers, heading instinctively for the carriers. This one streams smoke across the Kitkun Bay as it attempts to crash dive on the deck after being dealt a mortal wound. As the Marines fought for Saipan, the planes of Admiral Spruance's Task Force 58 engaged the Japanese fleet hundreds of miles away. The Japanese had hoped here to win a victory that would change the course of the war. But when it ended, the Americans called it the Marianas Turkey Shoot, because they had destroyed so many aircraft. Here, the carrier Shokaku, one of the attackers at Pearl Harbor, burns as it fights for survival, maneuvering to avoid American torpedoes. It sank that afternoon on June 19th. The naval gunfire delivered on Saipan was crucial until the Marines could land their artillery. It continued to help silence Japanese guns even after that. For the first 2 days, the fighting on the beach and just beyond was very tough. Marines crawled around the end of an amphibious tractor to advance on a burning Japanese oil dump. When the battle began, Garapan, Saipan's largest city, was intact. By the end, it looked like this. Most houses in Garapan had corrugated roofs made from Japanese steel. As the battle sounds ceased, the roofs were all that remained of most buildings. This wreck had been a Japanese Zero fighter just hours before. When the invasion began, carrier planes bombed and strafed the airfields of Saipan, preventing most planes from taking off. Concrete blockhouses were common in the Japanese defences of the Marianas. In this case, the blockhouse was left undefended at the edge of the Aslito airfield as the Japanese moved to the hills to consolidate their defence line. Long after the Marines had taken the beaches, they continued fighting a foxhole war, cautiously advancing against strong enemy opposition through difficult terrain. Saipan's coastal plain was surrounded by jungle, which provided excellent concealment for Japanese snipers, as these Marines had already learned. As the Marines drove north, the land changed, and toward the northern tip of Saipan Island, the terrain became much easier. However, the Japanese used every nook and cranny for defence. A Marine is about to throw a grenade into one of the caves where the Japanese held out. The Japanese staged several tank attacks like this one, observed by a Marine who found a shell hole useful for shelter. Each attack was broken up by American tanks and bazooka teams, which fired rockets at the enemy. A bazooka team on Saipan wipes out a Japanese machine gun nest during the drive north. The 37mm gun was used against light tanks and enemy positions. Here, the gun provides cover for Marines advancing against a strong point at right centre. As the Marines moved north on Saipan, Japanese resistance increased in intensity despite their lack of weaponry. The Japanese charged into the teeth of American guns, shouting "Banzai, may the Emperor live 10,000 years," and were mowed down like wheat. Once Saipan was secured, the Marines and Navy turned their attention to Tinian. Ships opened up with bombardments, as shown by this cruiser. As soon as the Marines left the beach on Tinian, the going got rough. The Japanese had the advantage of the terrain. The Guam invasion had been delayed by the sortie of the Japanese fleet, but weeks after the scheduled date, it began with the usual roar of American naval guns. Ashore, the Japanese reported being deafened by the barrage. This is the beach at Asan Point, Guam, with Marines landing. The coral reef stopped the boats offshore, and the men had to wade in. The landing ship tank, LST, could come into remarkably shallow water to unload its cargo. Here, a DUKW, amphibious tractor, emerges from the bow of an LST at Guam. Amphibious tractors crossed the coral reef at low tide. These vehicles made the landings in the Marianas much easier compared to the first landings at Tarawa in the Gilberts when Amphtrax were scarce. The amphibious tractor was effective on water and on the beach, but too valuable to take inland. Marines scrambled off on the beach and began the arduous foot soldier drive forward. American tanks accelerated the assault on Guam, but riflemen along the sides of the road were needed to flush out Japanese defenders one by one. Navy corpsmen and Marine stretcher-bearers worked steadily and at great risk to evacuate wounded comrades to hospital ships and aid stations. Finally, the Marianas were secured under American control, though the cost, as always, was higher than anyone cared to contemplate. Spruance, awaiting further orders, responded, "Please proceed at your discretion, selecting dispositions and movements best calculated to meet the enemy under the most advantageous conditions. I shall issue general directives when necessary and leave details to you and Admiral Lee." Thus, they were really going into battle. Mitcher and Lee were given the go-ahead to destroy the enemy, and the elation spread through the carrier fleet. On the evening of June 17th, the Kavala reported seeing the Japanese fleet, but only noted 15 or so large combatant ships heading east. When Admiral Mitcher received this report, he calculated that Rear Admiral J.J. Clark's 4 carriers, including the Lexington where Mitcher was riding, were just coming down from an attack on Iwo Jima. Rear Admiral W.K. Harrell's carriers were doing the same. The task force could be assembled that evening and steam directly toward the enemy. Although the Japanese were about 800 miles away, the forces could close that distance quickly, at perhaps 50 knots. They had the go-ahead from Spruance and could strike the Japanese that night if Admiral Lee agreed. Mitcher sent a message to the battleship commander. "Do you desire a night engagement? We may be able to make air contact late this afternoon and attack tonight. Otherwise, we would retire to the eastward." What Mitcher wanted to do was clear, but when Admiral Lee received the message, he was alarmed. The Americans had learned at Guadalcanal that the Japanese were superior in night naval actions. Despite the Americans' material advantages, including radar, they had not been properly trained for night combat. Admiral Lee wanted no part of a night engagement where skill could be the deciding factor. He replied quickly, stating, "Do not, repeat not, believe we should seek night engagement. The possible advantages of radar are more than offset by difficulties in communications and lack of training in fleet tactics at night." Lee added that he would be willing to pursue a damaged or fleeing enemy at night, but did not want to engage an undamaged, attacking enemy. Thus, the Americans missed their first chance to destroy the Japanese fleet. Instead of heading west toward Ozawa, they turned south and east toward Saipan. On the morning of June 18th, land-based bombers and Navy flying boats searched the air hundreds of miles west of Saipan, but found nothing. At 4:30 in the afternoon, when Admiral Obayashi had to be restrained from sending his planes out to attack, the Americans still did not know the Japanese fleet's location or composition. Spruance was confident the Japanese were not within 400 miles of Saipan. He was correct, but for the wrong reasons. When Admiral Ozawa's search planes located the American fleet that afternoon, Ozawa maintained a 400-mile distance from the Americans. At dawn, when the planes flew off, they could attack the American fleet and return, but the Americans could not reach them and return to their own carriers. Aboard the Indianapolis, Admiral Spruance changed his mind upon learning that Admiral Mitcher wanted to pursue the Japanese even at night. Though relieved by Admiral Lee's refusal of a night action, Spruance decided to keep Mitchell under control. With concerns about the Japanese splitting up and potentially threatening the Saipan landings, Spruance sent Mitchell a lengthy message, noting that the Japanese could come from various directions. It was not Task Force 58's role to engage the enemy fleet, but to protect the invasion forces on Saipan. Mitchell was instructed to steam westward by day and east at night, avoiding night engagements and focusing on finding and striking the carriers as soon as possible. Unfortunately, American search techniques were not skillful enough to locate the Japanese fleet, and Admiral Nimitz ultimately provided the location from Pearl Harbor. When Admiral Ozawa broke radio silence to call for assistance from Mariana's land-based air forces, Nimitz used the Huff Duff radio direction finder to pinpoint the location. As a result, Admiral Mitchell was sailing away from the Japanese fleet. With a chance to attack at daybreak, Mitchell requested permission from Spruance. Spruance, dismayed by this bold move, deliberated for an hour and then decided against the attack based on uncertainties, including a garbled report from Admiral Lockwood. Spruance's decision meant that the opportunity to destroy the Japanese fleet was lost. The Japanese might have other carrier groups ready to pounce. This estimate, of course, showed how little Spruance knew of his enemy in one sense, but it was completely in character. Ozawa knew that Spruance would never attack him first, for everything in Spruance's career showed him to be the sort of man who never took a risk. Later, he compared himself to Admiral Togo, waiting at Tsushima for the Russian fleet to appear. Given the circumstances, this was not a very apt comparison, for the essence of carrier warfare was to seek the first strike. Apparently, Spruance never did learn this basic fact, for his post-war reminiscences always justified his actions in the only way he knew, as a traditional battleship admiral given just another new weapon among weapons. It seems likely, given Spruance's whole deportment during the battle, that the initial battle order represented the thinking of someone else on his staff. For the second time, Admiral Mitchell had suggested that he be allowed to carry the battle against the Japanese, and for the second time he had been refused. Now he had to wait, ensure that his pilots were constantly alert for the first strike that Spruance was allowing the Japanese to make, and win the battle anyhow. It was quite an assignment. Task Force 58 was prepared for attack by the enemy. On the front line were the three carrier groups of Admiral Clark, Admiral Reeves, and Admiral Montgomery, each with 4 carriers arranged in the centre of a wide circle. Destroyers and cruisers formed the perimeter to provide anti-aircraft and anti-submarine protection for the vulnerable flat-tops. Clark was on the north, Reeves in the middle, and Montgomery on the south. About 12 miles of open sea separated each group. Behind Clark, by about 15 miles, came Admiral Harrell's carrier group of 3, also arranged protectively. 12 miles south of Harrell was the battleship force, with Indiana in the middle and the others arranged around her in a circle, interspersed with destroyers and cruisers. In front and behind the force were picket destroyers, whose function was to give advance warning of enemy aircraft. Spruance, whose demeanour now seemed totally defensive, suggested that in the morning Admiral Mitchell send a force to strike Guam and Rota Islands to knock out more Japanese aircraft. Mitchell, who was determined not to disperse his forces thus, answered placatingly but nebulously. He would keep the islands under surveillance, he said. Admiral Montgomery, one of the new breed of carrier men, was outraged by Spruance's suggestion that they begin spreading their strength thinly, and expressed his discontent in a message to Mitchell. Everyone concerned understood that Montgomery was indirectly addressing Spruance when he said, "I consider that maximum effort of this force should be directed toward the enemy force at sea. Minor strikes should not be diverted to support the Guam-Saipan area. If Spruance wanted to dilute their efforts further, why not detach some of the carriers and let the others focus on the battle?" The message was not insubordinate, as it was not addressed to Spruance, but it was as close as Montgomery could come to telling Spruance to step back and let them win the victory. The air searches launched around 1:30 on the morning of June 19th, and again around 5:30 produced no results for the Americans. Ozawa had really outfoxed them. They did not know where he was, and yet he had a striking force poised, simply waiting for the word from his early morning searches. The word came at 7:30. One of the float planes from the first search group, provided by the battleships and cruisers, reported the sighting of American carriers and gave their position. Admiral Ozawa gave the order to launch, and the strike began. The Americans were 2.5 hours away in flying time, so Ozawa had nothing to do but wait. Meanwhile, the battle had already been opened by Admiral Kakuta. During the night, after receiving Ozawa's message, Kakuta had been bringing up planes from Truk and other areas to Guam and Tinian. At dawn, the fighters and bombers took to the air and headed for the American fleet. A Zero fighter appeared suddenly out of a cloud and dropped a bomb on the picket destroyer Stockholm. The bomb missed, and the fighter was shot down by the destroyer Yamal. Either that plane or another must have warned the Guam command of the carrier's location, for half an hour later the task force radar screen began picking up a number of blips, bogies or unidentified aircraft, and part of the combat air patrol of the carrier Belleau Wood was sent to investigate. Lieutenant G.I. Overland was in command of the 6 fighters of the division. They flew the 90 miles from their carrier and arrived over Oroto Airfield on Guam at about 6:30. Below, they saw furious air activity. The Japanese saw them too and began firing with anti-aircraft guns. But the range was too long for them. The bursts exploded 2,000 feet below the planes, which were high at 15,500 feet. A moment later, however, they came under attack from a flight of 4 Zeros that swooped down from an even higher altitude. On their first pass, Lieutenant Overland shot down 1 Zero, and Lieutenant J.G. R.G. Tabler shot down another. More Japanese kept coming, however. As Overland called on his F-6F Hellcats to form up again in tight echelon, the Japanese came swooping in, 4 of them straight for him. Overland pushed over into a dive and screamed down to 8,000 feet, then pulled out and climbed back to 15,000 feet. He had lost the Zeros in the dive. Overland called for help and warned that the Japanese had a large force of planes on the island. One of the Zeros got on the tail of Lieutenant Tabler, but his wingman, Ensign E. Holmgard, shot him down. His fire blew half the Japanese plane's starboard wing off, and the plane spiraled down to crash in the water. But the action was getting intense, even as Overland called for assistance. Lieutenant Tabler saw 2 Zeros on his left and went after them, then, out of the corner of his eye, saw 4 more on his tail. He shouted, and the whole section dived for the deck at full throttle to shake off the enemy. Ensign C.J. Bennett got separated from the others and found himself surrounded by Zeros. He could feel the shock as the Japanese bullets struck the Hellcat. The superiority of the aircraft now saved him. The Japanese Zeros had been built light for speed, and the pilot of the plane shot down by Tabler had suffered the consequences when the .50 caliber machine gun bullets severed his wing. But Bennett was saved by the heavier construction of the Hellcat and the steel plate behind his seat that fended off the accurate enemy fire. In a few minutes he managed to join up with 2 other Hellcats. Zeros attacked, and he shot at one. It began smoking and turned away. He did not see what happened to it. He was too busy. Planes from the carriers Cabot, Hornet, and Yorktown arrived. The sky was full of vapor trails crossing and crisscrossing. Vapor trails were not characteristic of carrier warfare, but the meteorological conditions of that day produced them. The danger of collision seemed as great as that of gunfire as the Americans and Japanese rushed at each other. Lieutenant Overland nearly collided with 2 Zeros when they attacked. The Japanese were extremely aggressive, but soon discovered that they could not dive with the Hellcats nor compete with them in a head-to-head firing contest. The superiority of the new American fighter was complete. The action did not let up. Admiral Kakuta was doing his best to help Admiral Ozawa, and just after 8 o'clock in the morning, the carrier radar screens showed a large group of blips coming up from the southwest toward Guam. Obviously, Kakuta was sending reinforcements. Mitcher ordered 3 task groups to send fighters, and soon another 36 Hellcats were heading for Guam. Lieutenant Commander E.S. McCuskey led the flight from the Bunker Hill, and his planes were over Oroto Airfield an hour later. Below, they saw many Japanese aircraft landing and taking off. Lieutenant Heinzen's division was selected to strafe the field, while the other 8 planes of Squadron VF-8 flew cover. They were at 16,000 feet, but dived to 5,000 and then began firing. They fired until they hit 500 feet and then pulled up. Lieutenant J.G. Hobbs and Lieutenant J.G. Hannenkrat fired on a single-engine plane as it was taking off. The Japanese plane ground-looped and crashed. Lieutenant Heinzen and Lieutenant J.G.E.S. Duna also strafed and damaged 2 other planes. As they came out of the run, Heinzen saw 2 planes making approaches to land on Oroto Field, and they jumped on them. Heinzen overshot, but Duna shot down one Zero, which crashed into parked planes on the field, causing significant damage. Heinzen put a long burst into the second plane, and it crashed on the field. In a moment, Heinzen's flight was under attack by a swarm of Japanese fighters, and the Americans were surprised to discover that these Japanese pilots were extremely skillful. Lieutenant Hobbs got on the tail of one Zero down on the deck and managed to shoot fabric off the tail section. But then the Zero led him in over the field, and he had to break off when he realized he would soon be a very low-flying target for the anti-aircraft guns. McCuskey got on the tail of another fighter. As he closed the range, the Japanese plane seemed to be just waiting to be shot down. But the moment his guns opened fire, the Japanese pilot made a sharp diving turn and headed straight for the Hellcat, guns blazing, then seemed to cut the throttle and slow. McCuskey overshot, and the only way he could recover was to turn over on his back. They were at low altitude, and if he did so, he was very likely to go into the sea. McCuskey climbed and attacked another fighter, and this Japanese pilot used the same maneuver, the diving turn. When McCuskey rolled over this time with plenty of altitude, the Japanese pilot was immediately on his tail. McCuskey came back from the mission with a much higher estimate of the enemy's skills than he had before. The Japanese had obviously been studying the tactics of fighting F-6Fs and were using their superior speed but inferior turning ability against the Americans by employing the diving turn. The 12 pilots of the Bunker Hills Fighter Squadron accounted for 15 Japanese planes in the air that morning and several more on the ground. But the squadron did not escape unscathed. Lieutenant J.G. Brownscombe's Hellcat was riddled just forward of the tail section, and the left wing was badly damaged by an extremely proficient Japanese fighter pilot. All that saved Brownscombe was the strong construction of the F-6F. He ducked into a cloud and hid for a while, and then found a Japanese fighter in the cloud. He shot at it, and the other fighter's engine began to smoke. The Japanese pilot bailed out. Brownscombe ducked back into his cloud, and as he did so, he saw another Zero on the fringes. He made an approach on the tail, fired, and the Zero spun off and crashed into the sea. Brownscombe climbed to the top of his cloud and saw the rest of his division on the other side of the island. He managed to join them, and they nursed his plane home. Another violent maneuver or two and the tail might have broken off, but they met no more enemy planes. Lieutenant Duna called McCuskey and said he had a broken oil line and was going to have to head back. McCuskey joined him, and they headed for the Bunker Hill. But Duna did not make it back. The plane had been hit in the gas tank too, and either ran out of gas or the engine froze. He announced that he was going to land in the water. McCuskey circled and saw the F-6F hit the water and explode. The wreckage broke up, and McCuskey looked for a bobbing head. But no head came to the surface, so he turned and joined the others. They landed on the Bunker Hill without incident. Just after 10 o'clock, the radar operators saw Admiral Ozawa's strike force coming, 150 miles west of them. Mitscher had less than half an hour to prepare. He called in all the fighters that had been vectored out on search and combat missions, and ordered the carriers to launch all available fighter planes. At 10:20, they were launching as the Japanese arrived. But the Japanese, instead of boring in to take advantage of shock and surprise, began to circle and regroup as they came into sight of the carriers. This delay gave the carriers time to get all the bombers off the decks and to launch more fighters, and for the American fighters in the air to prepare. Aboard the Bunker Hill, the word came to launch fighters, and Lieutenant Commander R.W. Howell led a dozen F-6Fs into the air. They headed toward the enemy, climbed to 12,000 feet, and orbited, awaiting orders. Immediately after the fighter contingent had left the Bunker Hill's deck, Captain T.P. Jeter launched a bomber strike against Guam. By this time, Admiral Mitcher was cognizant of Admiral Ozawa's strategy and was determined to deny the Japanese any advantage from the shuttle technique. He sent bombers and fighters to hit the airfields again. Howell's group of planes orbited for 15 minutes while the fighter director decided where to send them. They were told to climb to 23,000 feet and head southwest, 260 degrees. 15 miles out at 20,000 feet, they would encounter a group of Japanese planes. Howell's radio was out, but Lieutenant Beauchamp heard, and he lifted the nose of his plane and headed up and in the proper direction. Howell and the others followed. Soon they saw several Japanese planes splash in the water below them. The main attack had come in several thousand feet lower and had been intercepted by other fighters. Those others were fighters from the Essex, Princeton, Lexington, and Enterprise, all of which had sent planes out, and they were busily decimating the Japanese fighters and bombers. Lieutenant Beauchamp and 7 other Bunker Hill fighters were too high and soon too far away to get into the action. But Lieutenant Commander Howell had never quite caught up with them, and his division had remained with him. When he saw the splashes, he was several thousand feet below and behind his shipmates. He nosed over, and the other 3 planes of his division followed, and they got into the fight. Howell made a run on 2 Zeros. They split off, and he followed one and shot it down. The other got away. The Bunker Hill planes then attacked 2 more Zeros, and one of them dropped, smoking, but pulled out above the sea and headed away. They saw 2 dive bombers and attacked them. Howell shot one down. It made a steep diving turn and fell into the water. Just then, a Zero attacked Howell and fired several bursts into the plane, damaging the wing and tail. Some shots struck the gun-firing mechanism. Howell's guns began to fire and kept firing until the ammunition was exhausted. He was having trouble with the stick, which tended to jam, and he decided to try to make it back to the carrier. He found the Bunker Hill, saw the big numbers CV-17 on the flight deck, and circled. Then the stick jammed all the way forward, and the plane went into an inverted power spin. He took one yank at the stick, and nothing happened, so he pulled the canopy release and bailed out at 4,000 feet. A destroyer picked him up and delivered him back to the Bunker Hill. He had 2 cracked ribs, but he was alive. The second section of Howell's division found several Zeros and attacked. Lieutenant Kirk and Lieutenant O'Boyle each shot down a Zero. They saw a dive bomber below them and attacked. But as they approached, before either could fire a shot, the dive bomber exploded in mid-air, and pieces of wreckage trailed down to the water. It must have been hit by one of the planes from the other carriers and blown up like a delayed-action bomb. By this time, Admiral Ozawa's second strike had reached the American force. The first strike had exhausted itself without doing much damage. The battleship South Dakota was hit by one bomb, which killed and wounded 50 men. The cruiser Minneapolis was damaged by a near miss, and several destroyers had narrow escapes. But by 11 o'clock, the first raid had broken up, and not one plane had reached its primary target, the carriers. Just about a third of the strike force headed back for their carriers. Of the total 69 planes, 42 were either shot down in this raid or managed to land on Guam or Tinian. Saipan was no longer open to air traffic. The Japanese garrison had retreated from Aslito airfield the day before, and the runways were under fire if anything moved. The Marines were bent on its capture in the next few hours. The Essex had sent up its fighters to meet that first raid, and they had shot down more than 20 planes. The leader of the flight, Commander C.W. Brewer, accounted for 4, and so did Ensign R.R. Fowler, Jr. Lieutenant J.G. G.R. Carr shot down 5. Commander David McCampbell and 11 other Essex pilots were also launched to meet the second strike, which was larger than the first. More than 100 planes were coming at the task force, and when they were observed by the picket destroyers out in front, they were identified as mostly dive bombers and fighters. McCampbell's planes were at 25,000 feet when they saw the enemy approaching. He picked a dive bomber halfway back in the formation. He planned to dive down on the plane, fire at it, and then duck under and attack another plane on the other side of the formation from below, but when he fired on the first bomber, it exploded almost in his face and caused him to yank the stick back to avoid collision with the debris. He had to pass above the formation and had the feeling that every rear gunner in every one of those dozen dive bombers had his gun trained on the Hellcat. But he made it across safely and put a long burst into another dive bomber, which began to burn and fell out of formation to the sea. He chased another dive bomber and shot it down from the rear, then made an attack on the leader of the formation. His attack produced no visible damage, so he came around and took a shot at the leader's wingman on the left, and the plane burst into flames. Then he came back and got on the leader's tail, firing long bursts until the plane began to burn and spiraled down out of control. His guns jammed, but he managed to clear those in the right wing, and they fired. The result, however, was hardly what he wanted. The uneven firing caused the plane to skid violently to the left, and he missed the enemy plane. He came around again, charging his guns, trying to make them work, and began firing. Still only the right-wing guns fired, but he managed to correct the angle and shot down one more plane before his guns quit completely. He headed back to the carrier. As he went, he took a look around. His squadron mates had been busy too, and the sea below was dotted with oil slicks and gasoline fires marking the points where aircraft had fallen for a distance of 12 miles. McCampbell estimated that they had shot down 90% of the Japanese bombers in that formation. Lieutenant Symes was leading the 3rd Division when his radio cut out, and he turned over the lead to Lieutenant J.G. Milton. Symes shot down one bomber and then saw fighters coming at him. He made a pass and shot down a Zero in company with another F-6F, so he claimed a half-plane destroyed. They were so close that ejected cartridges from the other Hellcats smacked into Symes's windshield. That plane was flown by Lieutenant Milton, who had already shot down one bomber but was determined not to miss any chances, so he kept boring in until the end. This was the last of their action, for as Commander McCampbell later wrote, "The sky was getting short of enemy planes." McCampbell's wingmate, Ensign Ree Foltz, shot down one dive bomber and then was attacked by a Zero that got on his tail. The superior speed and diving capability of the F-6F let him escape quickly, and he was soon back at the fray. But the Zero had done him some damage, for oil started spurting from the engine and clouded his windshield. He could see a dive bomber ahead, very dimly through the streaks, and he began firing. He was lucky, the bomber exploded and he pulled up through the debris.